Hello. So in this video we're going to talk about Helen Marie Casey's poetry chapbook, Inconsiderate Madness. So these are poems about or inspired by Mary Dyer, who was a Quaker martyr who was killed in Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 17th century. She was executed basically for religious dissent. And so because of that, I've decided to wear my Witchfinder General t-shirt, courtesy of Attaché Films. If you don't know that channel, that's a fantastic channel if you're interested in history, especially U.S. history, and historical film reviews or commentary. So, Mary Dyer. She was born in Massachusetts Bay Colony, which at that time in the 17th century was run pretty much as a fairly autocratic religious theocracy by the Puritan Fathers. Mary became a Quaker, so she had different religious views. And remember, the Puritans are the guys that in American mythology came over to escape religious persecution in England. So this same group, when they got to Massachusetts Bay, basically set up a theocratic dictatorship where the church fathers had absolute power over the community. And so when Mary becomes a Quaker, she adopts a different set of religious values and religious ideals. She starts to believe in a much more loving and forgiving God with whom you develop a strong interpersonal relationship, whereas for the Puritans, God was much more sort of Old Testament God of judgment and condemnation. There's a famous sermon by the Massachusetts Bay preacher Jonathan Edwards called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and that's basically the puritanical outlook. But that's not Mary's outlook necessarily. She endorses a more sort of uplifting version of God. So she was condemned to be executed, along with a number of other Quakers. There was a last-minute reprieve because the Puritan Fathers kind of said, you know, the optics on hanging a woman are not necessarily that great. So there was a last-minute reprieve, and basically she was exiled from Massachusetts Bay. I think she was sent to Rhode Island or someplace. And basically they said, you're fine, we'll commute your death sentence as long as you never come back to Massachusetts Bay. So Mary goes to Rhode Island or wherever it is, and she lives there for a little while, and then she's like, you know what? God is telling me I need to go back to Massachusetts Bay. Which she does. And the Puritan Fathers are like, come on. We almost hanged you once, and then we said you could go and live in peace as long as you didn't come back, but you've come back. So now we've got to hang you. And Mary was like, you do what you got to do. I'm going to do what God told me. And so in this way, she becomes a martyr for Quakerism. She becomes a martyr for religious freedom. And in some ways, she becomes a martyr for that sort of mythologized American spirit of doing what you believe is right, regardless of the consequences. So that's what's inspired Casey's chapbook. All of the poems are centered around Mary Dyer, with some of them dealing with other sort of figures related to the Mary Dyer story, like the poet Anne Bradstreet. There's a couple of poems about her. John Endicott, who was the governor who ultimately ordered her execution, Mary's execution, that is, not Anne Bradstreet's. So there's some other figures here. But one of the things that's interesting about the collection is it's very clearly taking a sort of modern stance, thinking about Mary Dyer as though she's a modern person in some ways, thinking about how the experience of being a woman in a patriarchal society condemned for your religious views would be perceived from the perspective partially of a 21st century psychology. But at the same time, there are clear roots in the 17th century. There are clear roots in the 1650s. And we get that in part because some of the poems are what we call persona poems, where the poet has adopted the persona of Mary Dyer and is thinking about what the experience would have been like for her. So we get this, for instance, in the poem Forsaken. I would give my life to love a God who consumes me utterly, inflaming my tongue, my breasts, my loins. Ablaze in the wilderness I would exalt him, give my body to his ravishing, be sweetest milk on his parched lips. He does not answer. I cannot find him anywhere. Anywhere. He will not be found out. So again, we've got this first-person perspective from the perspective of Mary Dyer, trying to figure out what it's like for her, what this experience was like from her perspective. But we've also got some other characters here. Again, we've got a couple of poems about Anne Bradstreet, John Endicott, some poems about or from the perspective of Mary's husband, William Dyer. But one of the ones that I think is really, really good is actually from the perspective of an unnamed old woman. So one of the things with Mary Dyer is that she had a child which had birth defects, and in the 16th century, basically from the medieval period up through the Enlightenment at the very least, birth defects were seen as a sign of sin. They were seen as a sign of some sort of, like, God's disfavor for you and or your baby. And so it was a very serious situation in Massachusetts Bay Colony with its strict religious laws. And so a lot of the poems actually have to do with that. And so Advice to Mary Dyer from an Old Woman is one of those poems. Mary Dyer, listen to me. There is evil in the wind. I hear it circle. I hear it flap its great black wings as if the devil himself will beat his way indoors. We know no cure, Mary, your unborn baby dead inside, unable to get herself born. Poor misshapen thing, never meant to live. We buried her out back beside the birch. If they come searching here, say you do not know. They will look for the devil's signs. They will see what they have come to see. Guard yourself, mistress, from men who come to do God's will. So again, we have a persona poem here, spoken in the voice of this unnamed old woman, who we presume is some sort of midwife or something like this. And it's a really interesting perspective, because on the one hand, there's something historically inaccurate about it, in the sense that, again, a stillborn child or a child born with physical defects, developmental disabilities, whatever it is, would be seen as a sin and a punishment from God. So that's the awareness of that is reflected in the poem without the sort of judgment that would have been more characteristic of the 17th century Puritans. On the other hand, we can make an argument that human beings have always had a greater capacity for empathy than our strictest laws, strictest theology, whatever it is, would suggest that we do. So maybe it's a more accurate poem because it raises those questions about the theology of the time. We get also a lot of religious commentary, particularly about this sort of autocratic Puritanism. So we see this, for instance, in the poem He Had Claws, a Tail, a Forked Tongue. They saw him everywhere. Where they did not see him, they saw clear signs. He rained down snow in summer. He made the earth to quake. Everywhere they went, he followed. He took the shapes of neighbors. He stole children. He led maidens into the fields. He signed their names in his book, danced naked for his children. He had many wives. He wept for those he lost. So again, we have this sense, this opening line, they saw him everywhere, or the opening three lines actually, they saw him everywhere, where they did not see him, they saw clear signs. We have this sense of this pervasive culture of religious suspicion, which is very accurate for puritanical Massachusetts. This idea that the devil was a constant threat that needed to be guarded against at all times was very, very central to their way of looking at the world. And I want to read you one more poem, because I think this is a really interesting one, giving us a good perspective on the absolute disdain that the Puritan Fathers, the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay, had for the Quakers. So this is the poem, The Bridge, 1659, and this is about the first time that Mary was going to be executed. Again, she gets a reprieve and gets exiled, but a lot of the other Quakers who were condemned with her actually were hanged. So The Bridge, 1659. The townsfolk came to see the Quakers hang. They thought to find fear, repentance, signs, some kind of lesson. John Wilson sneered at the accused, taunted them, got no satisfaction from it. The Quaker God sustained his martyrs. The men died praising him. The woman was reprieved. When they cut the bodies down, no one catching them, the skull of William Robinson was broken. The shirts were ripped off the dead, their naked bodies cast into a hole with no cover. The cold was raw. One woman reviled the dead. After, at Boston Neck, not far from the Common, the bridge fell and crushed her. So there, again, we've got this pervasive sense throughout the first portion of the poem that there's this absolute hatred, this absolute rejection of these Quakers for their religious beliefs. But then at the end, we've got a really interesting turn where the woman who reviled the dead is killed in an accident where a drawbridge collapses on her. So we've almost got this implication that God is in some way avenging these martyrs, which is really interesting. Certainly a mid-17th century people would be likely to take that as some sort of sign that this woman who shortly before had mocked these dead Quakers would now be killed in a freak accident. That would certainly be seen as ominous to a 17th century viewer.